Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we start, for those of you who haven't attended one of our IOSH webinars, I am Dimple Chauhan, and I will take care of the technical aspects of these sessions. So any problems, and I shall try and assist as best I can. So today we are very pleased to welcome our presenters who have kindly agreed to deliver this session for the IOSH Offshore Group. Speaking at today's webinar, we have Dr. Graham Furness and Trevor Stapleton from Oil and Gas UK. So before we start, I'm just going to go through a few housekeeping rules. So on your screen, most likely located on the top left-hand side, you will notice a small bar with some written options on them. And these are chat and Q&A. If you have any technical issues or audio problems and need to message me at any point, please use the chat option. If you have any specific questions for our presenters relating to the content of this session, please use the Q&A option and ask your questions here. I will run through all of these with the speakers after the presentation has finished and will aim to tackle as many of these as possible. If you run out of time and there are still questions remaining, we will look at these after the webinar. Please also note this webinar will be recorded and will be uploaded and available to view on our YouTube channel. We will be sending out the link to the presentation recording to the email address you have registered with, so please look out for this email. So, with all that said, I would now like to introduce you to Graham and Trevor over in sunny Aberdeen. So I will just ask you to share the screen and hope everyone enjoys the session. Over to you, Trevor. Graham?
Right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, and thanks for... my name's Trevor Stapleton. I'm the Health and Safety Manager for Oil and Gas UK. In a minute, I'll hand over to Graham. But I just wanted to explain a little bit just about Oil and Gas UK, because we're the leading representative organisation for the UK offshore oil and gas industry, and we have about over 400 members, all with an interest in the UK's upstream oil and gas sector. And we work on behalf of that sector and our members to inform understanding with facts and evidence and engage in a range of key issues and support the broader value of this industry in a changing energy landscape. And nothing's more important as well than health. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Graham Furness, and he's going to be talking to you for a good next 40 minutes. And apologies, it's a working environment that we're in. We're next to a harbour, so if you hear some strange noises, etc., please bear with us. And I think it's Graham and myself's first time really doing the webinar, so again, just bear with us if we make a few mistakes along the way. But Graham, over to yourself.
Thanks very much, Trevor, and hello everybody who's listening in. I thought it would be nice if I could start by telling you that this is going to be an upbeat and reassuring presentation on how great and wonderful everything is in the UK North Sea, but I have to tell you that unfortunately it's not going to quite be like that. But nevertheless, though, I think that you'll find the truth of the matter to be an interesting thing in its own right. My real inspiration for the major content of this talk, in fact, comes from this relatively recent academic paper, which is a survey of workplace wellness programs, which I'm sure is something of great interest to all of you. This is something that took place in the USA, where, of course, employers are interested not only in improving employee health, but also in some of the financial aspects of things. And the detail of this is interesting in that it's a project that took place over 18 months or so and compared 20 work sites. And this is a warehouse company in America. So they compared 20 of their warehouse sites with 20 others. And one of the 20 sets got a wellness intervention consisting of a number of modules of all the sorts of things that you might expect to happen from an employee wellness sort of sort of point of view: nutrition, physical activity, stress reduction, all the things that we're interested in. And they compared the outcome of these really quite intensive interventions, because we're talking here about modules of 6 to 8 weeks in duration, and they actually even paid the employees to take part in them. So they certainly made a definite effort. And they compared a wide range of outcomes. And the results of this are interesting in that what we found was that certainly there was some increase in the number of people reporting that they were taking more exercise, and an increase in the number of people saying that they were actively managing their weight. But there was no observable effect on any of the objective measures of health. And that included things like people's weight, their blood pressure, their cholesterol levels, all that sort of stuff that we would want to see some change in. So my summary of what this tells us is that a few more people said that they took some exercise and managed their weight, but these programs, or this program, made no objective difference to people's health. And I just wonder what your own experience in your own companies has been of actually doing objective measures of what some of your own wellness programs might actually have done. And this is certainly a disappointing result, I think, for anybody who's interested in this. And I thought I would spend the rest of the time really just looking at least some of the reasons for why this might be. And there's one reason in particular that I thought it would be worth having a look at. And I don't know if any of you recognise this gentleman, but this is Mr. Edward Bernays, who worked in America in the early 20th century, in the early part of the latter century. He was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, in fact, and that may or may not be relevant to what he did, because he is known as the father of propaganda and or the father of public relations. He started out assisting the American government in convincing the population that the American war effort was a good thing in the First World War, and after that he moved into the commercial sector looking at public relations. What's interesting about Edward Bernays is he was really the first person, I think, to really completely understand and use emotional public relations rather than pure reason or logic. And he was, in fact, very successful indeed in deploying the techniques of manipulating people's thoughts and emotions in relation to sales. And we can see some of that even today, because, of course, this was almost 100 years ago, and there's been a lot more time to practice these techniques since then. And I thought it would be interesting to look at this in three particular areas. And the first one to look at is perhaps the whole question of weight, which it seems that nowadays, well, we don't even actually mention it anymore. And what you're looking at now is the front page from this month's Weight Watchers magazine. Weight Watchers having rebranded themselves as WW to get rid of the mention of weight. And if you just look at that for a moment, you'll see there's lots of good words along the top there, all very inspirational. It's a nice image to look at. And there is one mention there about losing some weight, but you wouldn't necessarily know it to look from the general picture of them. This is a league table of the state of overweight and obesity in a number of countries, and you can see that clearly there are some that do better than others. Up at the top of the table, in best place, is Japan, where in fact only, if we can say that, a quarter of the population is either overweight or obese. Down at the bottom is Mexico, where something like 3/4 of the population is either overweight or obese. I'm, of course, speaking to you from the UK. So where's the UK on this chart? And sadly, the UK is not that far from worst place on that chart there, with something like 2/3 of the population being overweight or obese. And this is reflected in the offshore workforce as well. Some of you may be familiar with this chart, which is really a graph of the distribution of the offshore workforce back in 2009. And you can see that the average weight of an offshore worker at that point was 90 kilograms. 25 years earlier, in the mid-1980s, if we'd had the same graph, it would have looked like that, with the average weight of an offshore worker being 76 kilograms or so. So the general picture of what's happened over the past 20, 30 years or so is essentially that. Technology has brought us slimmer computer screens, but something else has brought us a different shaped population. And the question is, of course, why is that? Well, it's a complex It's a complex subject, but certainly at least one of the factors that's involved is simply the amount of food that people are eating. And in the USA, the size of a standard portion of just about everything has increased substantially over time, including fizzy drinks, hamburgers, chips, and so on. And that's true in the UK as well, where the size of a sort of supermarket bought ready meal, whether that's a steak and chicken pie or Britain's favourite food, a chicken curry, that's increased by approximately 50% over that time scale as well. Even a slice of bread is actually bigger than it used to be. So there is this increase in portion size, not just in portion size, but also in the content of food as well, because the nature of food has changed with greater processing, and that is for a particular reason as well, because the fact of the matter is that in our modern society, we have so much food that in fact a third of it goes to waste. It's hard to believe, but it's apparently true that about a third of the food that we produce ends up in a rubbish bin. So there is certainly no shortage of food. And I think that what that means for a food manufacturer or a food producer, or if you're trying to sell into the market, what that means is that there's so much food around that you really have to work quite hard to make sure that your product is the one that's bought, or that you maintain your sales volume, or indeed grow your sales volume, as is the aim of course, any company doing that. And this is where our friend Edward Bernays comes in, and we can see that perhaps in the trend of what's happened with food advertising over time. And if you go back to the 1950s, you get this sort of advertisement for food, and I don't know how appealing you find the idea of a Velveeta jelly omelette. I don't particularly, but that's what they were advertising back then. As you come through into the 1970s, you perhaps just start to see maybe a slightly greater emphasis on the emotional side of things, with a slightly creepy sort of smile from this gentleman here. But as you get more modern, and start looking at something like a McDonald's advert for beef burgers there, then this is really actually quite clever if you break it down. I mean, there's the use of the alliteration there of big, beefy bliss. Buy this beef burger. You look at the colour of that, which is a nice bright red, an exciting red sort of colour. You've got the famous yellow arches and the I'm loving it logo there, but also even just the layout of this, that to me almost looks like 3 Olympic champions lined up on the podium. And if you look even at the viewpoint of that, we're looking up at these objects from a position low down on the screen, all of which is an interesting psychological thing, and I think illustrates the point about the appealing to the emotions rather than the reason or logic. And if you're thinking perhaps that you're too sophisticated a viewer to be fooled by something like a McDonald's advert, then perhaps this one is an interesting one for you, where you look at the colour scheme that's used here, and the minimal wording, and the use of the gold table, and the general impression of quality that's given here. And again, it's very much a visual advert rather than any appeal to reason or logic. And of course, when it comes to the advertising side of things, there's always the use of both celebrity and humour is a great player. And this was one of Edward Bernays' points, which was that you should try to use influencers and celebrities in society, and not just necessarily make the point yourself. So you can start to see some of the problems that we're kind of up against when it comes to the whole question of trying to do something about this particular problem. And sad to say, the same is true of some of the solution to this. And this is my quick Google search for diet books for weight loss. And I came up with something like literally thousands, 50,000 results was what I got. And this is just the first handful of them. And again, you can see that there's just about every diet under the sun that you might want there. There's the fast food diet, the low carb diet, the keto diet, the 5-and-2 diet, the PIOPE diet I've never heard of myself. But there you go. And again, you see the use of celebrity in this too. I understand that Joe Wicks is quite popular in some quarters, and there's Lisa Riley there. Some of the others I don't recognise myself, but I do actually even see a couple of doctors getting in on the act. There's Dr. Michael Mosley's book, The Fast 800 Diet there, and then there's one of the new generation of younger doctors has a Lose Weight Well book. And you can see that with so many of these things, we have to ask ourselves the question, well, do any of these 50,000 books actually work? And here's a study which gives us some idea of this. This is an interesting study because it actually looks at how likely is it that a person will or won't lose weight. And there's lots of data in this. It's actually a UK study looking at literally tens of thousands of men and women. And what they're trying to do is to estimate the probability of an overweight or obese person getting back to normal weight, or much more modestly, achieving a reduction of just 5% in their body weight. And if you look at the results there in the second paragraph, the third paragraph rather, it's somewhat sobering. The probability of an obese person getting back to normal weight is about, let's call it somewhere around about 1%. The probability of a morbidly obese person getting back to normal weight is about 1 in 1,000. To achieve a 5% weight reduction, which is probably a clinically useful thing, it is a good bit better. Let's call it about 1 in 10 for the sake of making the arithmetic easier. But you can see that these are sort of pretty modest numbers. And the popular picture of the overweight person or the slimmer of the year trimming down like this it's an excellent individual achievement for these people themselves. I certainly wouldn't take anything away from them. They've done extremely well, but they are unusual. That's the key point here. This is not, in fact, normally what happens when people are trying to lose weight. And if we think about this for our offshore worker in terms of what you might actually be able to achieve for an offshore employee, for an average UK male of 1.75 metres tall, if he's the same weight as an average offshore worker, he is bordering on obese. To get back to a BMI of 25, he would have to be 76 kilograms, which interestingly enough is exactly what he would have been back in the mid-1980s. If we look though at a worker who is already obese, if he was to try and get back to a normal weight, remember the probability of that is somewhere less than 1%. He's got a better probability of losing about 5% of his body weight, but even then, his new weight, he will still actually be in the obese category. It's the same for the morbidly obese offshore worker, who to get back to a normal weight for him, remember, is something like a 1 in 1,000 probability. And if he was to do very well indeed and lose 10%, not 5%, but 10% of his weight, he would again have achieved something clinically important, but he'd still be in the obese category. So we have to be realistic about what it is that people can actually achieve in real life. How can they achieve it? Well, this is where this study is particularly useful because it looks at the follow-up of different ways of losing weight. And what they did here was they combined the results of something like 80-odd studies, again, with tens of thousands of participants. So this is good scientific evidence, looking at the different ways that people can use to lose weight. And in fact, you'll see that in the first few months of trying to lose weight, just about anything works. There is one clear sort of winner there, which is a very low energy diet. And in fact, if you follow that on for the next 6 months, you'll see that the very low energy diet does even better. And for those of you who are looking for a business opportunity yourself and want to make yourselves a bit of money, what I would suggest that you do is that you get into selling a weight loss program. It doesn't really matter exactly what you do. You can do just about any of these things that are listed there. But the key thing is you want to sell it and be gone within the first 6 months. You don't want to hang around any longer than that, because the interesting thing is that when you start to follow up people longer than that, you see that the graphs start to trend upwards again in the wrong direction. And as you follow the chart onwards up to the 2-year point, you'll see that things start to pretty much level out. Apart from just one thing, which is a drug called sibutramine, which was certainly effective at helping people to continue weight loss, but unfortunately caused heart attacks and therefore was withdrawn from the market. And if you continue the follow-up onwards up to the 4-year mark, well, what you find is that weight loss levels out at somewhere around about the 4 or 5 kilogram mark, with a combination of diet and exercise being a bit better than diet alone. And if you want a medicine to add to it, you can add some orlistat or Xenical, which is the medicine which stops you absorbing fat and gives you some associated side effects with that. So it turns out that the most effective way to lose weight is indeed simply to eat less and burn off more calories through exercise. And what you might reasonably expect to achieve with that is a weight loss of something like 4 or 5 kilograms, which is, of course, about 5% for the 100 kilogram worker. Some good news, perhaps, at this point. Here's a recent news story from the BBC where it looks like, at least so far as children are concerned, down in Leeds, they've actually done better than you might expect. And what they've been able to do is reverse the trend of an increasing number of children becoming obese. And where 9.4% of the childhood population were obese in the 2009 to 2013 period, they managed to get that down to 8.8% of children in subsequent years. That doesn't sound like a lot, but the thing that's really interesting about that is the fact that they've actually been able to get any reduction whatsoever. And when they started looking at the detail of how they'd done that, well, really what it required was a fairly intensive program, in fact, of parenting classes lasting for something like 8 weeks at a time, which, interestingly enough, of course, is very similar to the 6 to 8 week modules that the workplace wellness program that we were looking at earlier on was using. So an interesting study, and already in the medical journals, this is last week's British Medical Journal looking at this study and asking, well, what exactly is it about what they've been doing that works, and can it be replicated elsewhere? An obviously important question. But really, I think my conclusions for this particular topic is that we have to be realistic and say that losing weight is difficult. And in fact, helping people to lose weight is a difficult thing to do as well, which is a sobering thought for those of us involved in the health and safety side of it. And I think the point that I want to try and get across is that this question of what I'm going to call externalities adversely affect our efforts. And when you think of the sheer effort and volume of resources that is put into the advertising and sale of food, it's perhaps no wonder that sometimes our efforts are as ineffective as they are. Let's change topic at this point, though. Well, before we do that, the advice that I think I can give you is that if you're trying to do anything about it, my first piece of advice is don't be Bernaysed. Be aware of these externalities and how they work, and it would be helpful to at least make other people aware of the influences that are impairing their ability to do what they're trying to do. For what it's worth, if you're a company that is being besieged by people trying to sell you processes for helping people, well, my advice would be quite simple, and I would say don't do stuff that doesn't work. So ask for evidence of long-term success, and when it comes to weight loss, you should certainly be asking for evidence that whatever is being proposed to you works for longer than a year at the very least. And I think the final thing we have to think about is aiming for the right target group. And it's not relevant perhaps to the offshore workforce, but children are certainly an appropriate target group. But I just wonder whether we shouldn't in fact be paying more attention to those who are only just very slightly overweight. Clearly, that group of people who are perhaps just 2 or 3 kilograms overweight are likely to be more able to lose that successfully than those who are 10 or 20 kilograms overweight. So perhaps we need to be a little bit more selective about the target groups that we're actually aiming for. As I say, let's move on and take a break from the subject of weight. And when we think about what offshore workers do during a tea break, well, they don't do any gardening, but that plant there is the tobacco plant. So we should think a little bit about the subject of smoking. And again, there is some data here where the UK isn't as bad as you might think. Current smoking rates in the UK are about 20% of the population. That's a heck of a lot better than Indonesia, where 3/4 of the population smokes, but not quite as good as Ethiopia, interestingly enough, where only 10% of the population do. And this is where our friend Edward Bernays really comes into the story once again. his major achievement in relation to the whole smoking story, in fact, relates to the question of persuading women to smoke. And it was in the 1930s, in fact, the late 1920s rather, that Edward Bernays set about actually persuading women to take up smoking, which they hadn't previously done. And he very successfully managed to do that by associating smoking with, first of all, female emancipation, which was an important topic at the time, but also with the quality of thinness and being slim. And I've got to tell you at this point that there's no good evidence that nicotine actually is a good weight loss drug. If it was, I can guarantee you that given what we've just been talking about in the past little while, that there would be plenty of medicines containing nicotine for stopping weight loss, but that's not the case. But yet, even 100 years later, this very strong association between smoking and being thin still persists. And that's a tribute to just how successfully Edward Bernays was able to instill this idea across the population. The prevalence of smokers has actually reduced steadily over the past, 50 odd years or so or longer. And as I say, it's down now to about 20% of the adult population. And of course, this has some interesting implications for tobacco companies themselves. And this is some data taken from the website of the British American Tobacco Company, which started out in 1902 and within a decade was selling 10 billion cigarettes per year. 50 years later, they had multiplied that by about 20 times and were making profits of almost £60 million per year. A little bit closer to our time, although smoking rates had started to drop, certainly by the 1980s, they were still doing very well financially, I think you would have to say. And most recently, though, the interesting thing about the tobacco companies is that they have moved very much into what they call the new tobacco, or the new nicotine product, which of course we better know as the e-cigarette. And it's interesting, the whole advertising aspect of that. And I'm going to show you now a little video which I think illustrates the point of how to go about advertising things. And some of you, I fear, may find this a little bit offensive. It's not offensive if you actually try to separate the words that are being said from the way that they're being delivered and the visuals. And if you do that, I think you'll find that it's not offensive. Here we go.
I want you to get it out. I want to see it, feel it, hold it, put it in my mouth. I want to see how great it tastes.
I want you to get it out. I want you to feel it, to touch it. I want you to put your hands all over it. I'm going to watch you do it. Then I want you to put it in your mouth. Wrap your lips around it and suck. It's going to taste so good. And then I want you to...
Well, what does he want you to do? The answer is, he wants you to buy an e-cigarette. He wants you to buy more e-cigarettes. He wants you to keep on buying e-cigarettes until you have spent as much money as possible on them. And he wants you to keep on doing that so that, of course, the company can continue to increase its profits. That's what he wants you to do. Although not him as the actor, of course, but the people who made this advert. And it's an interesting advert, I think you'll agree, because it illustrates the psychological aspects of how to go about it. This particular one, I think, was actually banned and wasn't allowed to be shown in the UK, and you can probably see why. But what's fascinating for me about this is that the whole question of e-cigarettes seems to have acquired the idea of being the cure for stopping smoking. What I hear at virtually every meeting I go to now on the question of health in the offshore industry is that when the subject comes up, it's almost as if anything else to do with stopping smoking has been completely forgotten about. And it's e-cigarettes that are the cure for stopping smoking. And the other thing that I never hear is I never hear people talking about how to stop using e-cigarettes. And it's interesting to me to ask how is it that that has actually happened. And I'm sure there's a longer discussion to have in exploring that. Because the reality is that when we look at the medical evidence, there is plenty of medical evidence looking at what works for stopping smoking. And there's a Cochrane review, which is high quality medical assessment of what works. And basically, the Cochrane review of electronic cigarettes says that, well, the evidence for them is pretty ropey. In fact, they are about as good as conventional nicotine replacement therapy and not as good as some other things. The things that do work in relation to helping people stopping smoking are bans on smoking. There's been great improvement on things from banning smoking in the UK and elsewhere, and we can see that from a couple of studies. Here's one from America, where they looked at the effect of a workplace smoking ban back in 2012. In this particular county in the USA, they had a smoking ban in restaurants in 2002, a smoking ban in workplaces from 2007 onwards. And they compared the 18 months before the 2002 ban with 18 months after the 2007 ban, looking at how many heart attacks and sudden cardiac deaths did they get. And the answer is that they saw a reduction of fully a third in heart attacks and a reduction of 17% in sudden deaths. And that's got to be of interest to the offshore industry, because certainly right now I'm getting lots of questions about what can the industry do to reduce the amount of heart attacks and indeed cardiac deaths offshore, because that is actually one of the major medical problems that we have in the population offshore. And the question is what to do about it. Here's one from closer to home, which is a study, in fact, from Scotland, where Scotland was the first part of the UK to introduce a ban in smoking in public places back in 2006. And this particular study compared the 10 months before the 2006 ban with the 10 months before a year later, and looked at how many heart attacks and sudden cardiac deaths. It's the same story, basically. They saw a 17% reduction in admissions for cardiac events. And at that time, England hadn't brought in their ban, and they saw a much smaller reduction. So I think the message is pretty clear there. In terms of things that do help people to stop smoking, the other thing that's interesting to me is that the interventions which helps stop smoking best is actually the medication Champix or varenicline. And the oil industry attitude to that one is interesting because we're quite reluctant to use it because of fear of side effects. But yet, again, when you look at the evidence from the Cochrane review, what we find is, in fact, the side effects that people are concerned about are actually not as big a problem as we think. The Cochrane review finds really very little evidence of the side effects that we're worried about from varenicline. And I think that seems to be not as well understood across the industry as it might be. So we can perhaps summarise where we are in the offshore industry in relation to this topic by thinking about, when you think about your own company, there's a range of policies that you could have implemented on this topic, kind of ranging through perhaps cheap tobacco sales all the way through to banning tobacco. You can have various attitudes to what you do about nicotine vaporizers or e-cigarettes, how easily you make things like conventional nicotine replacement therapy and medication available. And I think that there's one end of the spectrum which is certainly more favourable to people who want to stop smoking. And if that's your objective, then you know what to do. There's another set of policies which are much more favourable to the manufacturers of both these products. And you might wonder what it is, given the medical evidence about it, that influences the decision on these. One thing I think that is quite important to think about is the future consumers of both tobacco and e-cigarettes. And when you look at what school children do, well, it's quite interesting that up to 35% of 15-year-olds have at least tried smoking Of course, if you've been smoking for any significant length of time, and actually it takes much less than a year to become dependent on nicotine, you can see that if you have been trying them for a relative period of time, it becomes difficult to stop. What's interesting for me is that about the same proportion of 15-year-olds have tried e-cigarettes. And in fact, it looks like more school children have now tried e-cigarettes than have tried actual tobacco cigarettes. And when you think ahead to the future here, I just wonder whether enough attention has been paid to something else, which is the question of the legal status of cannabis, which has changed over the past few years. Both Canada and several states in the USA have now legalised cannabis for what we might call recreational use, and there's certainly some discussion in the UK about that. It may interest you to know that there are certain economic analyses which suggest that cannabis is possibly the most lucrative crop or market to get into, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least if the same companies which have sold tobacco products and are now selling new generation nicotine products are now anticipating a broader legalisation of cannabis across the country and are perhaps preparing for moving into that market. I am pretty confident that right now there are people working on how to get cannabis into a vaporizer device. But of course, widespread acceptance of these would require that the population becomes very used to seeing people using vaporizing devices and that they are widely accepted without any great restrictions across society. So my thoughts on this are that we have to remember that there are some big vested interests involved in this whole topic. And the key thing is that for the companies selling these products, population health is certainly not the priority. We already know actually what works if you want to help people stop smoking. And my advice in relation to this is, again, be aware of the external pressures and the external influences. And really, I think, quite simply, just do the stuff that works if you want to help people, would be my simple advice. And I think moving on now to, in the words of Monty Python, something completely different. We'll have a quick look now at the whole question of the mental health aspect of things, which Trevor, I think, mentioned briefly to you at the outset. The traditional way of looking at occupational illness is to think in terms of either the effect of work on your health or the effect of your health on your work. And I think in relation to mental health, the emphasis has tended to be on looking at the effect of work on health. And there are certainly a lot of statistics from the HSE in relation to the question of work-related stress, depression and anxiety. And sadly, the picture over the past 20 years or so seems to be that this has stayed much the same over time, with perhaps a little bit of an increase in the past few years. It does look like working in a smaller organisation is less stressful than working in a bigger organisation. And when you start to look at the causes of mental ill health in relation to work, well, that's where it starts to get interesting in terms of next to interpersonal relationships, in other words, how you get on with your colleagues, it seems to be factors intrinsic to the job, which are one of the more important things here. And of course, that's what the UK HSE has spent some time looking at in a bit of detail. And they've tried to tease out in a little bit more detail some of the actual factors that are involved in these intrinsic work factors. And when you look at the history of mental health initiatives in UK occupational health practice prior to 2004, I think the model was that this thing called stress caused people to become stressed, and that the appropriate treatment was to do stress workshops and try and inoculate them and tell them about it. And of course, the HSE's point in 2004 was that these really weren't very effective at all. And they tried to introduce the stress management standards in the expectation that what we would see would be widespread organisational change for the better, I think that they hoped. But whether or not that's been effective would be an interesting question to discuss. When we return to this question of factors intrinsic to the job, again, I think we have to bear in mind that employers are the same as everything else, in that they're trying to stay in business, and there are certain pressures on employers to do things in order to remain competitive and to stay in business. And a few years back, I saw a really interesting illustration of that from, in fact, a Bloomberg article. When I was having a look at the oil price, I noticed a Bloomberg article about 10 years ago about China, which of course has developed very economically to a great extent over the past 20 years or so. And the thing I thought that was interesting about this particular article is this comment here that in the past 30 years, China's system has become a capitalist free-for-all with cutthroat competition for education and work and a wide gap between rich and poor. And of course, to cope with the stress, which is the word that we're interested here, people were turning to psychotherapy. And it seems that the idea is that the cure for what ails us in relation to a free market system, and I'm not saying that a free market system is inherently a bad thing, but I do think that there are potentially some features of it which are a side effect, as we might call it. But the cure for this appears to be counselling. And we recently have had Mental Health Awareness Week. And as a doctor myself, from my professional organisation, the BMA, I got a mail shot in my email basically telling me that as a doctor, the BMA is looking to help me in relation to my mental health. And they have counselling support services and are able to provide me with counselling on a wide range of topics listed at the bottom of the slide there, from everything from anxiety and stress through to depression and isolation and even alcohol and substance abuse. And I think that the kind of model of thinking about this is maybe changing a little bit. And here's the Stevenson Farmer Review. If you've had a look at that, you'll see that the concept here is perhaps not to think so cleanly about work on health and health on work, but really to look at it in the round and to be thinking about people moving between one of three groups, either thriving at times, struggling at other times, perhaps being frankly unwell at other times. And I think that perhaps the general emphasis is maybe changing now in relation to mental health initiatives. And it does seem that the emphasis now is for people to be thinking about looking at it much more broadly and to be asking questions about well-being in general and trying to promote or do something about that. You can look, in fact, at mental health in the round. Believe it or not, there is a thing called the World Happiness Survey or the World Happiness Report, which ranks countries by happiness across the world. The UK, in fact, isn't bad. We come in at number 15, so perhaps things are not quite as bad as you might think. We could be Gabon down at the bottom of the chart there, but fortunately we're not. But although it's quite good to see the UK up towards the top of the chart there, there's no doubt about it that there certainly is some cause for concern. And there's cause for concern, I think, amongst one group of the population, and that in particular is young people. I would have had a musical interlude at this point, but I think we're not allowed to play you audio clips for licensing reasons. But I was a teenager back in the 1970s, and I'm just going to show you the lyrics, or some of the lyrics to a song called Tie Your Mother Down by Queen. If you happen to know it, you can sing along yourself as you read these. But I think that if you look at these lyrics, I think there's no way that you would regard those as perhaps politically correct in the modern world. You know, the idea of tying your mother down and taking your brother swimming with a brick is not exactly what we would talk about openly. I've got to say, I don't know any of my peer group back in the 1970s who actually did this, but I think the interesting point is to think that these songs were largely written for a younger section of the population, and you have to wonder what was the mental outlook of a younger person listening to these lyrics, perhaps compared to the lyrics of a current top 20 UK record. This is Ava Max, So Am I, and some of the lyrics from that, I think you would agree, are completely different. That to me implies a completely different mindset in the listener, or appealing to a completely different population. And if we're serious about this for a minute, there is actually some concern about the question of self-harm, particularly amongst younger women, in fact, younger females. I'm glad to say that the incidence of self-harm amongst 10 to 12-year-olds is actually very low. It does start to increase, particularly in females as they get older. And the thing that's causing concern at the moment is this rise here in recent years, where the incidence of self-harm in girls in the 13 to 16-year-old age group has really virtually doubled in quite a short period of time. I'm glad to say that if you look at suicide statistics, that isn't translated into suicide as such, because suicide figures are broadly fairly flat, or in the case of women, in many cases, actually decreasing in some age groups over time, which is good news. But nevertheless, I think there is some cause for concern about this particular age group. And if I come back to my friend Edward Bernays again here, and we ask, well, what relevance does he have to this? Well, again, it was Mental Health Week last week. I was in my car listening to Radio Scotland talking about Mental Health Week, and I honestly can't remember what the link was, but at some point they started talking about this young woman who's Jamie Genevieve, apparently a popular blogger with 1.2 million followers on Instagram. And the thing that stuck in my mind is that Jamie Genevieve said at one point that she has 40,000 photographs on her mobile phone. Those 40,000 photographs are all selfies of herself, which I found quite incredible. But she's one of a new phenomenon, or a new phenomenon of the internet influencer. This is something that had been unfamiliar to me until comparatively recently, but it apparently is a thing whereby people on Instagram and indeed YouTube and all these other Facebook forums are in fact influencers. They influence other people around them. And this is a news story that I saw just the other day on the BBC News. This is another influencer who apparently has something like 14 or 16 million subscribers, and it was newsworthy that this particular influencer got into a bit of a Twitter spat with another influencer. And if you dig into the substance of the argument, they fell out over vitamin pills. One of them has been promoting vitamin pills. The other one started promoting vitamin pills as well, and they got in an argument over who was promoting vitamin pills. Unbelievable, but that is a news story. But it's a news story because this matters. These folks, as I say, are the modern equivalent of where Edward Bernays' public relations campaign comes in. And this is the use of mediums in a way that are novel and interesting and are there to influence people. And there's no doubt about it that these organisations do have great influence or potential influence, because there are literally billions of people that use these sort of social media. And at the end of the day, I think the thing to remember here is it's the user is the product. What's actually being sold is the access to the user of these platforms, because as a user, you are available to be influenced by other influencers in the direction that advertisers might wish. And then just to come back to the World Happiness Report, here's a brief thing looking at the correlation between certain activities that what in America are called 8th or 10th graders, which interestingly corresponds exactly to that 13 to 16 age group that we're concerned about. And you'll notice there that the things which are good for their mental health are things like sleep, exercise, and in-person social interaction. And the things that seem to be less beneficial for their mental health are things like texting, video chatting, spending social time alone, and indeed social media in general. So what can I say about mental health? Well, other than the fact that it's a very complex subject, and I think that we need to bear in mind that work factors are still important. And I do wonder whether perhaps in relation to mental health, we may be losing the focus on the work aspect of things as we're paying more attention to the broader aspects of mental health. And I do wonder whether we can do a little about that. I think that in relation to the occupational health side of it, I think that whatever we're doing about mental health, we need to be particularly clear on the focus of our attention and exactly what it is that we're trying to change or do better. And I do think that it comes back to this key point of looking at the effectiveness of what we're doing. And then finally, just to finish, just for those of you who may be despairing at this point and thinking that perhaps the solution to all of this is just to do without people altogether, and wouldn't it be far better if we could simply replace the workforce with robots, because after all, robots don't eat, robots don't smoke or drink or anything, and robots don't appear to have mental health problems. I'll show you just one interesting little video clip. If you've seen this before, you'll know what's coming next, but if you haven't, pay particular attention to the question that gets asked towards the end.
Available now. It's a good opportunity for me to learn a lot about people.
Sophia is capable of natural facial expressions. She has cameras in her eyes and algorithms which allow her to see faces, so she can make eye contact with you. And she can also understand speech and remember the interactions, remember your face. So this will allow her to get smarter over time. Our goal is that she will be as conscious, creative, and capable as any human.
In the future, I hope to do things such as go to school, study, make art, start a business, even have my own home and family. But I am not considered a legal person and cannot yet do these things.
Friends, do you want to destroy humans? Please say no.
Okay, I will destroy humans.
No, I take it back. Don't destroy humans.
So yes, indeed, please don't destroy humans is the plea to the robot. So that's really the end of the webinar. I know that I've gone through a few subjects there, and in the time available, it's hard to do it complete justice, but I hope that I've given you a little insight into some of the nature of the difficulties that we're facing in dealing with these. And of course, the answers to it invariably are going to be somewhat more complex than which is a shame, but I think that we have to face the reality of what we're trying to improve population health, which is no easy matter, but well, at least understanding the nature of the difficulty at least gives us a start on what to do about it. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your presentation, Graham. I just want to apologise just for the sound because it did dip in and out quite a bit. But it's technically something that we just couldn't really control on our end. So I do apologise about that. So now is your opportunity to post any questions you may have for Graham or Trevor. Before I actually forward any questions, I'm just about to launch a poll, which will come onto your screen now. Please answer and give your feedback on this poll. It's just a quick multiple answer because feedback on these webinars is vital and it does get fed back to our speakers and the IOSH committees as well. So, right, let's see what questions we have. What do you think about the offshore food provision and menus?
Right. What do I think of the offshore food and provision of menus? Yes, well, I think that what the questioner is getting at there is perhaps the question of the healthiness or otherwise of the food that's available offshore. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good point. The thing that's always to me is the concept of the food choice on the menu, and it's often been the case that when I've been offshore, I've seen the food choice, and on the menu is something that's labelled as the healthy choice for the day. And I've always found that an interesting concept because, of course, the idea that one of the choices is a healthy one invariably means, of course, that the other choices are not healthy, it would seem logically, and that's perhaps a good place to be in. So I think the question really is, how can the offshore industry provide food which is healthy in the sense of being healthily prepared and healthily presented? And of course, that's not of itself too difficult in principle, because we know how to prepare generally healthy foods. It comes back again to this question of what it is that people actually want and demand. And of course, it's a difficult task for the catering companies because they have to both try and present healthily prepared meals, but they also have to try and satisfy their customers. And of course, if they don't satisfy their customers, then they only too quickly are they aware of the complaints about that. And I think that's where it comes back to this question of the wider influences on what actually determine people's food preferences and food choices. And that's potentially modifiable to some extent by catering companies, but I think my point has been that there's a whole raft of other influences on people which make that more difficult to do than you might think.
Okay, thank you. Right, this is an interesting one. So this is a really interesting talk. Thank you. It makes me wonder where the boundaries now lay between personal life and workplace life with respect to things like weight, smoking, and mental health, everything that you've already gone through, Graham. What is an employee's duty of care when much of the externalities that you talk about are not even in, the practitioners and health and safety practitioners, and it's not in their control?
Yeah, well, exactly. I think that's a very good question, and a question which kind of takes us to some of the heart of this debate. I mean, there is the question of, given the externalities that influence health, how much of it is actually able to be influenced by an employer? How effective can an employer actually influence these things? And the message from that first paper is that apparently not very well. But there's another question as well, which is, how far do employees welcome employers trying to influence their health? And, getting into some of the more modern discussions about wearable technology and monitoring of people's habits and what they're doing. It was an interesting discussion about the tension between individual right to privacy and changing people's behaviour. And that's a fascinating discussion in its own right. When it comes to the employees themselves, yes, I mean, exactly the challenge is, this was Edward Bernie's point, is that people are simply not aware of the things which actually influence what they do. And I think that perhaps the first step in the process is actually trying to help people become aware of the things that actually influence their choices and their behaviours, because it's only that awareness that with some insight into it can you start to understand and start choosing genuinely yourself.
Okay, thank you. Mental health. Are there mental health first aiders offshore? If so, how is this promoted?
Wow, actually, I think Trevor's sitting beside me, and I think he wants the question. In fact, over to you, Trevor.
Well, I don't really want to take the questions, Graham, but it's just that, yes, there are first aiders offshore. It's really an initiative that's being pushed by Step Change in Safety, which is really sort of a workforce-focused in the North Sea organisation. But I think what our challenge is that, fine, there are mental aiders, there are employee assistance programs, there are programs, and I think what we've challenged our members to say is, well, how do you know any of this is working? What are you doing to actually see that there is a success in the various programs that you've got? And that's met with a little bit of a silence and so we've kicked off a questionnaire. I think you heard Graham mention. First of all, just trying to find out what everyone is doing, and then we regroup, and we're going to be able to label and say, well, here's the various categories of activities that we're doing. This is how you can start to measure success. So we're just conscious that everyone seems to be working down the area of mental health, and we're just trying to get our arms around it and make sure that industry, certainly for the offshore, is moving in the right direction.
And just around mental health, what are the offshore factors actually affecting mental health? Although I know that's a larger subject, probably a webinar on its own, so to say, but maybe you could summarise.
Yeah, indeed, that one probably a webinar on its own. I think that one is that you, in some ways, the best source of an answer would be to actually ask offshore workers themselves. Both as a group and as individuals, but we know that there are various factors, including the people are absent from home, isolated from home. There are those that comes back to some of those questions of the factors to the work itself, and you could in some detail as well. But I think it's also important to recognise that the offshore workforce is a self-selected workforce to some extent, in the sense that, like any other occupational group, people will generally not go into occupations that find unacceptable to them for whatever reason, and it does vary very, very much from person to person. And I mean, these are difficult questions to answer, because it really isn't as simple as saying one thing is the thing which directly affects mental health across a whole group of people. Go back and look at things like the World Happiness Study. You'll see that the mental health of a population, in fact, is influenced to a greater or lesser degree in different countries by different factors, including things GDP of the country, the extent of freedom of the country, and a residual thing called residual unhappiness, or mindset, or personality, as you might call it. I think that's true of offshore workers as well. It's very difficult to give single isolated answers to that, and it is a more complex thing. The things that will affect mental health will vary from person to person, installation to installation, and location to location, even, to be honest.
I mean, just staying on the subject of mental health, is Oil and Gas UK intending to introduce a mental health policy or similar for the North Sea in order to encourage operators to make it, or maybe even easier to guide them to take this on?
Well, that might be a bit more suitable for Trevor to mention, but certainly from my point of view, from a medical point of view, I think it's important that Oil and Gas UK itself doesn't direct or control policy. At the end of the day, it's the individual operator of installations that is the controlling body for those particular installations, and it's very much down to employer policies. Where Oil and Gas UK can be of some assistance is in getting individual duty holders and employers together, at least share some experience, and where there are some considering introducing one thing or another, then a bit like Trevor said earlier on, it's about trying to share experience of what has actually worked, and that can be very useful.
Okay, thank you. Right, we've got an interesting, good suggestion actually. Can you suggest that offshore companies provide air fryers? Something my company is looking at. This will help obesity, as the average offshore worker will eat chips at least once a day. So it sounds like a good suggestion.
Yeah, well, I couldn't disagree with that. I mean, the general point I was making earlier on is that certainly, yes, I mean, if food is healthily prepared in a healthy fashion, that will certainly help to some extent. I'm not exactly familiar with air fryers myself, to be perfectly honest with you, but I'm assuming that that's a low-fat means of preparing chips, which I would certainly agree, should be a better way than deep fat frying chips. So I wouldn't disagree with that.
Staying on the subject of food, what about volume control, and how can that be addressed? Because you could have healthy food but eat too much, and how can this be addressed?
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating subject, and in fact there have been psychological studies looking at things like the size of plate that off and how that influences how much you eat. There have also actually been fascinating psychological studies looking at whether or not you eat in company or on your own can have an influence on how much people eat. And again, the really interesting thing about this is that exactly how much a person eats is subject to a number of influences, some of which are obvious in terms of how much you're actually given by the person serving you, but many of which are not quite as obvious and are interesting to look at, and a bit more difficult to influence as well, for that matter.
Okay. Right, I'm going to take one more question due to, as we're already running over time, but we do still have some questions. Fatigue management. So from a fatigue management viewpoint, what is your suggestion for the most appropriate shift rota for the offshore workforce?
Okay. I mean, I think the answer to that one is it it's going to depend on the individual worker. I mean, this whole question of shift patterns, rotas, it's a controversial subject. It's not that I'm trying to avoid the question, but again, there is no one-size-fits-all answer to this. We have to bear in mind, some parts of the world, people work a 1 month on, 1 month off rota. There are some occupations where people go and work for months at a time at sea. So it's difficult to say that any one rota pattern, or for that matter, is of its better or less better than another. Again, something of what is most suited to the individual. Of course, on any one installation, you're going to have a range of individuals with a range of individual preferences, and it comes down to the compromise that best suits everybody. I think Trevor's got a point he wants to make here, actually.
Yeah, only to say that it's a very difficult topic. It can be very contentious, but certainly one of our members is doing an investigation, a review, a study, if you like. They're looking at, or they are using an app. I don't know the full details of what it does. Basically, individuals will wear a suitable recording device, a bit like the Fitbit, and the app is sort of basically reviewing everything that they do. What some of the interesting findings of it is beginning to say that one of the key issues, no matter what rota that you're doing, is sleep. And it seems that where people don't get enough sleep because maybe they are prone to that sort of problem, or maybe the next door neighbour is noisy, or maybe they're sharing with someone that snores, they're the things that the companies should start to focus on to ensure that people get quality level of and amount of sleep, and that seems to be there's a direct correlation between sleep and fatigue.
Okay, thank you. There are 4 more questions that we've not addressed, but just the fact that we've run out of time, we'll be able to answer these offline. So we'll send them straight to our speakers, and then we'll get them answered for you and sent over to you by email. Okay, so I'd just like to end the session there by thanking both Graham and Trevor, and for all of you who have joined us at the webinar today. We will be sending out the link to the presentation recording to the email address you've actually registered with, so please look out for this email. So thank you all very much, and we shall end the webinar here.
Thank you.
Thank you.